Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and today my guest is Luis Elizondo. He is a former senior intelligence official and special agent who led the Pentagon's ATIP program, or the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program, which effectively studied UFOs from 2007 to 2012. And he joins me today to talk about his experiences doing that, as well as some of the content of his recent book entitled Imminent. And who knows, maybe some tidbits of information about what's to come in UAP disclosure in the coming months. So, Lou, thank you so much for your time. It's great to speak with you today.
Rob, thank you. It's truly my sincere honor and privilege speaking with you. In your intro, you briefly mentioned about ATIP ending in 2012. Just for clarity, it actually did not end. The funding channel for OSAP, which was the greater contract vehicle, ended. But then there was some other efforts underway within ATIP to secure additional funding. And so it actually continued. What a lot of people don't know is that it continued all the way till the day I resigned in 2017 in October. And I suspect it continued, and the natural metamorphosis of that was later on as a UAP task force led by my former colleague, Jay Stratton.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And it turned out that one of the enemies we faced was bureaucracy. And I can tell you from personal experience that my background chasing terrorists and spies pales in comparison the challenge we face in fighting the bureaucracy. And so there's this kind of unwritten rule in the Pentagon and in other aspects of national security that if you can't fix a problem internally, you don't stay and make the problem worse. You leave and you resign and you take the conversation in a different direction if you need to. But you don't want to stay behind and continue to be a disruption to the chain of command. And it's really not that uncommon. In fact, my boss at the time, General Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense at that point, a year later he resigned too in protest. So it's not uncommon that if you can't fix a problem internally, that you resign. You don't make the problem worse by staying there and being counterproductive to the department or to the agency. And so, ironically enough, I left my job to finish the very job they gave me in the first place. Ironically enough, a lot of people say, "Well, did you leave because you were scorned and you were upset?" Not at all. I actually left out of a duty of loyalty, not disloyalty. I actually still love my Department of Defense. I still have my security clearance. I still work with elements in the intelligence community very closely because I want to help my country. And if I have certain skills or abilities that are useful to the U.S. government, I will certainly use them, provided that they're being used for the right purposes. And in this case, I am very, very committed to disclosure and increased transparency on the UAP topic. I think the U.S. government has put itself in a corner over many decades and now is trying to desperately to find a way out of that corner and level with the American people. And I want to help that process. I don't want to hurt anything. I want to help. And so that is the primary motivation for what I do.
Why do you think there's been so much secrecy on the part of the government about concealing this info about UAPs? Is it more about international power dynamics, or is it a question of national security that some of this information might be dangerous if let out and given access globally?
Very thoughtful question. Yes, and yes, and even yes to a question you haven't even asked, which is why do governments have secrets? And there's really three primary reasons why governments have secrets. One is to prevent information or secrets or technology or capabilities getting into the hands of the adversary. And from that perspective, I completely agree. For example, if there's some sort of advanced technology out there that has a capability to enter into any country's airspace completely unchallenged and interfere with nuclear equities, I don't necessarily want someone like North Korea or Iran having that capability, right? So we keep those secret so our enemies don't have an advantage. And we also don't want to broadcast maybe what our intelligence gaps are, what our limitations are, what we don't know about something. But there's two other fundamental reasons why we have secrets, which, by the way, for the record, I don't agree with, for the record. So option one, we keep secret for foreign adversaries. Yes, I agree with. The other one is that governments and religious institutions and organizations are always solution oriented. They always are. This only works because the people, the citizens, have faith and confidence in those institutions. And when those institutions fail the people, then they've got a significant problem on their hands. And so let me give you a real case example of how often this occurs. During the 1950s, the United States government, right at the beginning of the Cold War, tensions with then Soviet Union were very high. We had a treaty with Russia that we would not fly manned reconnaissance missions over mainland Russia. So what did we do? We did exactly that. We developed with the CIA and Lockheed Skunk Works the U-2 spy plane, a plane that in theory would fly so fast and so high, the Russians would never see us coming. In fact, couldn't even track us or ever see us. And so for the first few missions, it was successful because guess what? The Russians did not react. It wasn't until the Russians developed the SA-2 surface-to-air missile and successfully shot one down and paraded the pilot powers in front of the United Nations and the world and the wreckage for all to see, did they admit to even to their own people that they were tracking every single one of our flights. The problem is they did not have a capability to stop it. They had a vulnerability and they didn't want to broadcast it. So they kept it secret even from their own people until they had a solution for their issue. Another reason why governments have kept this topic quiet for so long is because there's this notion of governmental preeminence, meaning the idea that governments have the final authority and kind of this omnipresent monolith that knows everything all the time. And the reality is that's not true. The governments are made of people, and people have make mistakes all the time. And there is this concern that the moral fabric of society is really reliant upon the government, that the government's responsible for ensuring that people don't have mass panic and that everybody pays their mortgages on time and their cell phone bills. And so, public pandemonium is something that all governments seek to squelch. And so, in this particular case, there are examples. Another one, for example, is when in the late 1940s the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was a very, very long time before the scientific community ever released the translations of those Dead Sea Scrolls. And the question is why? Well, the answer is because they were afraid it was going to contradict the current understanding of the Judeo-Christian belief system, right? So that America and the world couldn't handle the truth. And that is another thing that I disagree with, that I don't think governments should have the right to decide what people can and can't handle. It's like going to the doctor. Look, if I've got a bad diagnosis, I want to know because maybe then I got a chance to beat it, right? Don't just tell me everything's hunky dory when it's not. And so those are some of the principal reasons why governments in plural, not just ours, other governments too do it, keep things secret. Now, according to policy, you're really only supposed to keep things secret for two reasons, and that's to protect sources and methods. You can't classify information simply because you're trying to cover up governmental malfeasance or perhaps something that's embarrassing. There's strict prohibitions to do that. And unfortunately, our government did exactly that for a very long time.
It seems like this conversation over the past several months has evolved beyond just seeing things in the sky into questions about who are we as human beings with the emerging information about psionics within the military and interacting with UAPs. And one of the interesting things that I read early on in your book is your experience with remote viewing programs. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that all ties in with the UAP narrative?
Sure. Well, let me preface, what I think remote viewing is, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. A lot of people consider it very spooky and psychic abilities and things like that, and it can be a turnoff for some people. The reality is that the United States government and Russia and other countries have been engaged in efforts to use human cognitive abilities to conduct espionage on each other. And what I mean human cognitive abilities, I mean something referred to as remote viewing in this country, or in the vernacular, psychic espionage. Now, a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, our government actually use psychics to conduct espionage? Yes. In fact, local governments use it all the time to help solve murders. You may not like the term psychics, of what that kind of infers, someone sitting behind a Ouija board or behind a crystal ball, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that's probably based in quantum physics, the phenomenon that allows human beings to see things without being directly in front of those things to report on. And it may seem a little weird, but the reality is that it was very successful. And we were using it was most famously known as Stargate, but before that, it was Grill Flame and a bunch of other iterations before that. CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency as well, DIA, the United States Army, INSCOM, one of my old units, were heavily involved in this program. And by the way, so were our adversaries. And so I had a very early point in my career. I was being considered for a position within a remote viewing effort, and unfortunately, towards the very end, Congress had pulled all the funding previously, and the program somewhat died on the vine. There were some people in Congress that were afraid that this was something that was too spooky. They couldn't understand it. It conflicted with their theological belief system, so they pulled the funding, despite the program actually being quite successful. Um, and so yeah, that was my foray into the remote viewing world. I believe if you were to ask me what is remote viewing, I think it's a vestigial capability that we've had for a very long time. In fact, I think it's shared with animals as well. I think it's a survival technique before we had, as a species, the sophistication of verbal language like we're having now. We weren't sure, the village next to us, if they were hostile or not. And so there were these ways to figure out without using, verbal language to maybe, help with our survival and evolution. Look, when two dogs enter a room, obviously there's some sort of nonverbal communication going on, and they're trying to determine if each one is a threat. They're not barking, they're not growling, they're not talking, but there is some sort of communication going on, and that allows them to identify friend or foe. So I believe that that is really where remote viewing comes from. I think it's probably a lot of neuroscientists right now are speculating whether human consciousness is actually a part of quantum entanglement. Uh, and if you know a little bit about quantum mechanics, you realize that it's a totally different set of rules when you're talking about the universe at the very small level. Proving you actually can be in two places at once, and weird, odd things like that. Spooky action at a distance, as Einstein once said. So we're learning a lot every day about the reality, and that the fact that there may be holes in the universe, new dimensions, if you will, that subatomic particles uh, uh, live in. That these subatomic particles ebb in and out of existence continuously, and they're going somewhere else and then coming back. So it's a very strange and perplexing phenomenon. But it turns out that statistically there's a lot of evidence to suggest that remote viewing actually works and can be used to a great effect.
For most of the general public, it seems that this type of psi phenomena has been relegated to the realms of like the crystal balls and fortune tellers, as you mentioned, or sci-fi movies and TV. Do you think there's a reason for that?
Well, it's something we don't understand. It's something that is not normally accepted as being part of our current paradigm. But look, we're always learning something new, always, as a species. And I would submit to you that let me give you another case in point. So I told you I was in at the University of Miami, and these programs, microbiology and immunology. If you were to take a 24-hour clock, and that is the existence that humans have been around in modern form. So most anthropologists suggest that human beings in modern form have been around between the last 200 and 400,000 years. If that is the case, take a 24-hour clock. It was roughly the last 5 minutes of our existence, 2,000 years ago, plus or minus, maybe 10 minutes of our existence, that we realized there's two fundamental life forms on this planet. And it was the Greeks who recognized this. And they said, you are either a plant, or B, you are an animal. And human beings fall under that animal category. And it wasn't but for the last maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds of our existence. It was 350 some years ago during the Renaissance that we discovered an entirely new form of life on this planet that's been on this planet all along with us. That's neither plant nor animal, and that was the world of fungus. And we thought, wow, what a great achievement that is. We spent all this time on this planet only now to realize that there's this whole other life form. And it wasn't but the last 5 seconds of our existence, towards that stroke of midnight, the last 120 years, where we discovered the true alpha life form on this planet. In fact, if you take all the biomass of every plant and all the biomass of every animal and all the biomass of every fungus and add it all up together, it still doesn't add up to the biomass of this life form that is a true dominant life form and always has been on this planet. And it wasn't until we could curve glass and stick it in a little metal tube and famously shout the words, little beasties, did we discover the world of microorganisms. And these microorganisms are inside every human being. They make up who we are. They are found in places we never thought conceivable for life to exist, like on the skin of the ISS space station, where the radiation is unimaginable. They thrive miles beneath the crushing depth of the Arctic ice. It is pervasive, and until we only just now had the technology to realize and discover the true dominant life form on this planet. So I think we have to remember that hubris is the enemy here. We always think that we have an answer to something, and Mother Nature is always teaching us a lesson. If there's one thing that we're right about, is that we're usually wrong at first. And I would encourage people to look at things like this very much the same way. Look, DARPA has experiments. You can put a helmet on a certain helmet on a pilot, and he can fly a drone using his brainwaves. I mean, don't look now, but that's psychotronics. That's an interface, a technical interface that is translating human brainwaves and cognition into an act, right? So it's not science fiction, it's science fact. And I think the problem is that there's been this stigma around it for so long, partly because it does not comport very neatly with a lot of religious preconceived views. A lot of people consider it, quote unquote, demonic or anti-Christian or anti-whatever. Um, but in reality, it's probably remote viewing is probably something very similar to our appendix. It's a vestigial organ, or in this case, a vestigial capability that we really don't use anymore.
Something that ties in a little bit with that is this emergence of these CE5 protocols that we've been hearing about. I've been following the work of Jake Barber's group Skywatcher, Stephen Greer, someone else who practices these types of things with groups of people, where they basically conduct these ceremonies that attract UAPs. And then they can like monitor and see them, or just experience, having them around. What are your thoughts on procedures like that?
Well, we have to be very careful. There's been people out there, I'm not going to name names, that have made a cottage industry for themselves, taking advantage of people and lying. Um, you know, Having people pay large amounts of money for a UAP or a UFO experience, then having them sign NDAs to keep them quiet, only to turn out that someone's being paid $500 to throw flares out of an airplane and fake a UFO experience. And so we have to be very, very careful. There's a lot of people out there that will claim that they have the answer and they're the only ones. And, give me $10,000 or $5,000 and I'll take you out on an experience, but then you can't talk about it, right? And by the way, we can't replicate this process. So I'm very concerned about those individuals. There are individuals like Jake Barber who are legitimate individuals with legitimate backgrounds who should be listened to because of their experiences with the U.S. government, inside the U.S. government, for the U.S. government. They held top secret security clearances at the highest levels, and they're trying to do something as an experiment to see if it works. And so I'm all for that, for experimentation. I cannot tell you one way or the other. I don't like using terms like CE5 because that was invented by somebody, just like the term remote viewing. I believe that if you really want to have a conversation about is it possible for human consciousness and cognitive abilities to interact with something beyond, um, I don't think it's that far-fetched. And the reason why is because the human brain is pretty complex. And we know there's a lot of things that happen that we don't really understand. And if you are interacting with a species, whether it's here on Earth, right? So you're interacting with a dog or maybe the village next door and they don't speak the same language, that that development of you want to call it psychic ability could be an evolutionary trait that is not just relegated to Earth. This could be something that is universally, to the most part, could be consistent with other life forms, other intelligent life forms throughout the cosmos. Meaning, For the same reasons why we developed it to worry about the village next door, we worry about potentially, or new life forms would worry about it with interacting with things from another planet. So I think we need to ask ourselves, are these type of vestigial survival capabilities only relegated to Earth? If a lot of other animals also experience it here on Earth and have the same ability, and humans do, maybe it's not so special. Maybe it's something that is experienced uh, um, throughout the cosmos. Whether it be us working, we're learning about a village next door. Are they a threat, or is our planet next to another planet a threat? Right. So I don't think it's that far fetched. A lot of again, neuroscientists are now speculating that human consciousness is somehow rooted into quantum entanglement. And if that's the case, we know that quantum entanglement is one of the only things that is faster than the speed of light. Now, people say, well, you can't break the universal speed of light. Well, believe it or not, in the communication of quantum entanglement, you can have an object separated. You can have these two objects per se, a pen and this, and let's say they're quantumly entangled. Um, when I act on this object, this one will respond. Meaning, if to get more technical, we're talking about spin of quarks and things like that. But if you have two entangled particles, when I do something here, this one will respond or react in a very prescribed way, and that's true if they're separated by 2 inches, if they're separated by 2 feet, 2 miles, or 2 billion miles. Right? It's that action is instantaneous, and we know that because the Chinese and even us have done experimentation that validate that. So if human consciousness is tied to a quantum process where there are no limitations and speed of light doesn't matter, then a whole lot of things become possible.
You've mentioned many times that UAPs could be regarded as a potential threat or should be regarded as a potential threat. Given that we've been seeing UFOs and UAPs for decades now at this point, and there hasn't been any large scale active aggression on humanity, why should we be cautious and estimate them as a potential threat when researching this?
Well, I've always said potential threat. So let me caveat potential, and let me put on my national security hat for a minute. There's a lot of people out there that will say, well, they haven't done anything yet. Well, yeah, you're talking about your own timelines and your own time frames. When we go and invade a country, do something called preparations of the battle space. And it's important because you want to do long range surveillance and look at the capabilities of a country before you invade them, right? So you don't get tactically and strategically surprised. Um, if you, again, I'm wearing my national security hat now. If you have something that is conducting reconnaissance on our military equities over decades, which we've seen, has the ability to fly into our controlled airspace unchallenged, as we have seen, and has the ability to interfere with our nuclear equities, as we have seen, then one must worry, because if this was an adversarial country like China or Russia, this would be a big problem. This would be a very big problem. And furthermore, people say, well, they haven't done anything but taken down and if you will, um, turned our nuclear weapons off for a short period of time. So that's a good thing. That's like parents taking the matchsticks out of a child's hands. But the opposite is true in Russia. In fact, Russia, there was a UAP incident that actually turned them on. And that's, if not scary enough, I would submit to people, look, at no time have they ever interfered with our nuclear ability to kill each other. When we dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and subsequently vaporized 500,000 human beings off this planet, UAP didn't stop that. In fact, UAP didn't stop us testing these atomic weapons to become nuclear weapons later on in the Nevada desert. They did not stop the proliferation of these weapons getting into the hands of Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and everybody else. In fact, they didn't stop the ramp up of us in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we almost went to nuclear war. They didn't stop anything regarding, if you look at 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Fukushima, nowhere did UAP come in and stop those catastrophes. So one has to scratch their head. There's zero evidence of them interfering with us from a beneficial perspective. But there is some data to suggest that maybe from a military perspective that we should be at least aware, not necessarily paranoid, but aware. And then if you take into context some people's experiences with these things, right? I mean, you can sit in the lotus position and go, oh, look what beautiful lights. The reality is that there's people out there that have reported terrifying experiences with these things. And the term abduction comes to mind. Now, keep in mind, again, still wearing my national security hat, I'm a former special agent and a special agent in charge. When someone has been taken, if you have, do you have any kids? You mind if I ask you, Rob?
I do. Yeah, I have two kids.
Okay, so let's say your kids want to go to the mall, they jump in an Uber, but instead of being taken to the mall, they're taken to the Uber driver's house. How would you respond to that? I mean, that's the way I look at it. That's kidnapping.
Yeah.
And then, God forbid, someone touches a loved one without their permission. Well, that's assault. So now we can start racking up the federal charges, right? Federal kidnapping charges, assault, blah 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 blah. That's what some of these people are reporting. So if that's the case, this was being done by a human, that'd be a crime, be a felony. You go to jail for that, right? Why is it okay for these things to do that if that is in case indeed what is happening? Again, if that is what's happening, I don't think it's wise for us to just presume that all these things are friendly and benevolent. I'm not willing to risk my life or my family's life, and I'm not willing to risk your life or your family's life for that. Now, let me take off my national security hat and put on my Lou Elizondo hat. I don't necessarily think they're a threat either. They could they, as some general suggested, well, they're doing preparations for the battle space and they're planning to do a large scale type invasion at some point. Yeah, but we haven't seen any indications of that. It's possible these things are frankly just as natural to our planet as we are. Just like I said before in the analogy of microorganisms, perhaps we're at the point now technologically we are interacting with a new type of species for us, but it's been here all along. In fact, maybe they're from under the oceans, and we're not at the point technologically where we can interact with them. So I don't necessarily think these things are even from outer space. We don't know. Are they from outer space, inner space, or the space in between? Are they interdimensional? I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. Um, Maybe we're just now coming to grips that there's something else here very advanced that's been here all along and just as natural to Earth as we are. So I'm very careful, wearing my two different hats as a human being. I always say with every new question comes opportunity to learn. And I don't think we should be afraid of necessarily UAP per se. I think we should be more afraid of our reaction as human beings to something of unknown origin. That scares me more because we as human beings have a really bad track record of overreacting and doing things in a manner that is probably not very consistent with diplomacy, let's say. So I had a general, I've been about 3 years ago now, I briefed him at the Pentagon, very senior general. After about an hour of the interview, he turned to me and said, Lou, this is great, all interesting, but look, at the end of the day, I just need to know if one of these lands on the White House lawn, what do I do? Do I put my hand out in friendship, or do I put an M16 to its head? And I've said, my dear general, you missed the point of this briefing. Both of those could be wrong. You're thinking this in binary terms, and this may not be a binary solution. This may be something different, and either one could doom us. It could be absolutely the wrong way to do things. You put your hand out in friendship, maybe whatever it is, if it's malevolent, thinks you're weak and annihilates you. If you put an M16 to its head and it's benevolent, all of a sudden it thinks you're a threat. And we're we're a very basic species on this planet, so they could wipe us out. So I think we have to be very careful uh, when we ascribe something as being a threat. That's why I say it's a potential threat. And if I could, again, forgive me with these terrible allergies. Let me leave you with an analogy that on this particular question that I've often told people, and hopefully it demonstrates my perspective. So, Rob, I'm sure you live in a wonderfully beautiful part of the country. Do you mind if I ask I'm not going to ask you what state. What state do you live in?
I live in Canada, actually. I'm up in Montreal.
Great. So Montreal is gorgeous. I just came back from Montreal. Absolutely gorgeous. So let me ask you this. Do you lock your front door at night before you go to bed?
Absolutely.
And I do too. And in fact, not that you expect anything bad to happen. I know you live in a beautiful area, but the reality is just out of extra precaution, most of us will go and lock their front door. And some of us may even, like myself, go and check and make sure all the windows are secure before I go to bed. And if you're like my wife, she'll go before she goes to bed, she'll punch in the security code and turn on the alarm system. And we do that just out of due diligence. And let's say one morning now, some Sunday morning, you come downstairs and all of a sudden now, you have come downstairs, have a hot cup of coffee. You notice size 11 muddy boot prints on your living room carpet that were not there the night before. Now, no one's been hurt, nothing's been put out of place, and nothing's been taken. But despite you locking the doors and the windows or turning on the alarm the night before, there's now boot prints in your living room carpet that were not there the night before. My question to you is that a threat? And my response is, well, it could be if it wanted to be. So we better figure out how these boot prints are getting the hell into our living room at night. It's very much the same thing with national security. These things can come in and out of our controlled U.S. airspace. There's not much we can do about it. We don't know how they're doing it necessarily. We have some good ideas, and they have the ability to interfere with things that we consider are crown jewels from a national security perspective. So that is why, from a national security perspective, we pay our leaders to be solution oriented. And even if there's only a 1% or a 5% chance these things could be benevolent and not malevolent, or could be malevolent and not benevolent, I think that's too much of a chance. We can't risk that. We have to do our due diligence as a just in case and approach this, very objectively. Again, not fear mongering, not saying these things are a threat, but you want someone to always have that alternative analysis and say, look, there's a potential here. So let's just be prepared just in case.
We know that the United States has recovered some of these craft, and that there have been efforts to understand the technology and back engineer them. There have also been some claims that certain abduction events or sightings have been perpetrated by the United States military and not by the whatever extraterrestrials or other beings. What are your thoughts on that? Is there any potential truth to that?
Wow. I'm probably not ready to go there yet. Let me let me share this with you. Any government who conducts experiments on its people without their knowledge and without their permission is the enemy. And now let me be very clear with that. Any government, and by the way, we have done that in the past as a government. My country here has done that. We had things like the MK Ultra experiments where we provided LSD unknowingly to people, and some of them actually died as a result, going into a psychotic state. The Tuskegee experiments, where we allowed the people, namely African Americans, to to suffer from syphilis to its natural end, which is death. We allowed that to happen. We actually, even though we had a cure for it, we allowed these fellow Americans to die simply in the name of science. Um, that is repulsive. It is repugnant, and that is, dare I say, when governments do that, they need to be fearful of something much greater. Because if the people, once the people find out, it's like waking, it's like being stuck in a telephone booth with a sleeping gorilla. That gorilla's sleeping, but make no mistake, when the people find out, and i.e. in this analogy, the people are the gorilla, they will rip you apart. They will. This only works. This idea of democracy in our government because people have faith and confidence in its institutions. The moment that the government deceives and betrays the American trust, then it's got a very significant issue on its hand, because if people know how to deal with that, and there's a history of human beings dealing with situations like that. And so it terrifies me. I don't want to ever think my government could or would do that to other human beings, but we have in the past. So we can't discount it entirely. I like to think that there's no one that I know in the government that would ever do that. I certainly would never do that. It's anti-American. It's anti-democracy, and I would never, if I was even privy to something like that, I wouldn't tolerate it. If you think I'm being loud now by blowing the whistle on UAPs, you just wait. If it turns out that our government has been doing that to other people. Now, with that said, I can't entirely discount it, and there's reasons for that, which at some point I may be prepared to address. Um, I there's information that is forthcoming, I think, in the not too distant future that may substantiate that maybe there were elements in our government that were doing things that were were not very ethical. And one thing is to experiment on a human being if they allow it and they volunteer for it. But if you do it with people unsuspecting, or worse, with children, then I've got a significant issue with that. If you look at Army regulations, even on the Army side of the Department of Defense, we have procedures for doing intelligence work. And one of those is a probe, what they call questionable intelligence activities involving human experimentation as procedure 13 violation. And there's prohibitions for doing that. You can't do it because why? Well, in the past we did. And we got caught and we got in trouble for it, right? When I say we, not me, I wasn't part of those, but organizations that I belonged to in the past, they did those type of things. And so Congress passed laws saying you can't do this anymore. Um, my hope is that that's the case, that no one is coloring outside the lines and doing some sort of human experimentation. Um, again, I know I'm not answering your question directly because you're talking about, the term psionics and CE5 and all these other terms, people, words du jour, names du jour that we give to things that people are trying to do. But the government has a long history of doing things and being involved in this topic, particularly UAP. And I wouldn't be overly surprised if in the future we learn that, yeah, maybe we were involved in doing some things that were ethically not very good. Um,
Well said. We've been talking about disclosure, using that term pretty much since the 2017 New York Times article and the accompanying videos that were released. What does disclosure mean to you? Is it more about getting the information from official sources out, or is it about how the public accepts that information and integrates it? Because it seems to be two completely different things. We've had admissions from people like David Grush about non-human biological entities being recovered. That to me sounds like as close to disclosure as you can get, but we're still not at the point in society where people are talking about this openly. So how do you interpret the definition of disclosure?
well, I think it is interpreted differently by some people. Some people, spell disclosure with a capital D. Some spell it with a small d. I've always maintained that disclosure is a process, not an event. A lot of people say, well, I know we'll have disclosure when a senior member of the CIA uh, tells me it's real. Well, we already had that. We've already had a former director of the CIA. We had a former director of the National Intelligence. We had a former president of the United States. We now have members of Congress. I mean, you're being told. I think disclosure is here. I think we are experiencing it right now. It's not necessarily the flavor and shape and size that some people expect, and maybe it doesn't comport to their preconceived narrative of what they think disclosure should be. But I think we're having it right now, and I think that there's a conflation between the terms disclosure and confirmation. Confirmation is a little different. That is having a preconceived narrative or notion and then having it confirmed. I'm not sure we're going to have confirmation because I'm not sure a lot of the preconceived notions that people have are necessarily accurate or correct. But I do think we're going to have disclosure, and disclosure may be something that is going to be hard to recognize because it may come across as well. Okay, yeah, the next generation realizes we're not alone, and the government kind of admits it. And oh, by the way, they're studying it, and they have this organization called Arrow now. I mean, they're being reported to the government. So I I think disclosure is happening. I don't think it's happening in a way that people necessarily expect, but I'm kind of glad for that because we don't want it to be disruptive. Personally, I'm against catastrophic disclosure. Now, what is catastrophic disclosure? That's full open kimono on everything. And the reason why I fear for that is because I don't necessarily want, like I said before, an adversary like North Korea or Iran to have, the capabilities that we're seeing with these UAP. And that's, for example, one of the reasons why the American people can hear certain information, like the fact that North Korea has now atomic weapons and potentially nuclear weapons. That's unclassified, but how those missiles work, how many they have, where they're pointed, how they fly, that still remains classified. And I think that's what disclosure is going to look like. The mere fact that, yes, we've been dealing with this phenomenon for a very long time and it's real. But some of the other specifics, maybe we're not going to have that conversation anytime soon, right? We know going back to 1940s about the Manhattan Project. We know about the atomic bomb and we know about nuclear weapons development, but we still don't know how the atomic bomb is actually made. Most people don't anyways. Some of us do, but the general public doesn't. And why? Because we don't want people replicating that capability, right? We don't want to broadcast to our adversaries, oh, here's a blueprint, how to wipe out a million people in an instant. That's not smart. That's not smart business. And so I think disclosure is very much the same way. We're talking about a technology that's truly revolutionary. And I think we have to be very, very careful making sure that technology doesn't get in the hands of real adversaries.
If you had the power to subpoena anybody at all that you wanted, who would it be?
I'm not going to mention names, and the reason is because I don't want to. If those names, those people are going to be subpoenaed, I don't want that cat getting out of the bag. I don't want to do something that will interfere with Congress's efforts to do their job on this topic. And I certainly, if there's some people out there, some potential bad actors, I don't want to give them a heads up. I don't want them preparing for anything, and let the process work. People like Dave Grush, I admire tremendously for his fortitude and his courage. People saw what happened to him within 24 hours of testifying. They tried to destroy his reputation. Uh, and I understand what that's like. I've been dealing with that for 7 years, going back to these people out there that accuse me of being disinformation agent and a psyops. I mean, it's just silly. But that's the kind of brutal reaction that people who come out are going to face. And the reason why I say this, because there are people that might get subpoenaed that are friendly, that are not the bad guys, right? And in that case too, I also want to protect them because there's a lot of crazies out there that will start harassing them and start threatening them. And I've got threats on me all the time. I mean, I can't count how many. Look, I was put on the ISIS Al Qaeda kill list in 2014, and I've had more death threats against me now talking about this topic than I ever did chasing terrorists. So think about that for a minute, right? So I also don't want to mention names who should be subpoenaed because if they're friendlies and they're good people, I don't want to expose them until absolutely necessary.
How has this whole process changed your own life, being thrust into the public spotlight, presumably being recognized by a lot of people? Has it changed your life in any unexpected ways, or were you completely prepared for what would come?
Nothing can prepare somebody. Look, I for public exposure and scrutiny. I spent my entire career in the shadows. I often liken myself, if you want to know what it feels like, think of an albino cave newt that is living very happily in the dark recesses of a cave, and is blind. All of a sudden, some school children come on a field trip, pluck you out of obscurity, take you outside under the hot, burning sun, and start poking at you. That's what it feels like. It's extremely uncomfortable. I love interacting with human beings and people, but public life is a little bit different, because you can't fight back because you have a moral responsibility to always take the high road. And it's hard, in the words of Mike Tyson, right? It's pretty amazing what people are willing to say when they're sure they're not going to get, punched in the mouth. Um, so they take advantage of it and they get away with defaming and lying about people and libeling them. And it really shows the dark underbelly of social media. Now, with that said, I've also had the honor and privilege of meeting some fantastic people. It's a double-edged sword because I met some very, very good people, some people that have become very close friends of mine, um, with my public engagement and social media. But of course, you have the vocal minority that in some cases they have an agenda. In other cases, they suffer truly from some sort of mental illness. And from that case, I can't blame them. If someone is truly mentally ill, all I can do is pray for them and hopefully they get the help that they need. There's a lot of wounded souls out there. So I don't take those personally. What I do take personally are those who have a specific agenda and will call somebody, label somebody something when they themselves are really the largest perpetrator of that. It's this contradiction, if you will. And to me is that's very concerning. And it's been tough for my family particularly because they see the hate and they know the death threats that I receive. There's a reason why I live in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, with 5 German Shepherds, and I'm heavily armed. I mean, that's not a coincidence. Um, and it sucks. You shouldn't have to live life that way. But unfortunately, I do because of the path I chose. And that's no one's fault. It's mine. I take ownership of that. Um, again, I love the ability to interact with people who really want it, like this conversation. This is what drives me. If it wasn't for conversations like this, I'd have a much more difficult time dealing with. Um, I am probably one of the few people that don't really care about my public persona per se. I care about getting the information out. I care about the mission, and that is my personal mission: is to get the truth out to the American people and hopefully the world. It doesn't make me special. If you wanted to ask me, Lou, what do you consider yourself? as a public person, I tell everybody I consider myself an unexceptional man living through exceptional times, and I'm not doing anything that anybody else wouldn't do in my shoes. If you had seen what I've seen and been where I've been and done what I've done, I think everybody would have made the same decision I did. And hell, maybe, arguably done a better job. It's possible. So, I know I tend to be kind of painted as the face of disclosure, but the reality is I'm not. The reality is you are. The reality is your audience is. We are standing shoulder to shoulder. I'm not the leader. I'm just one voice among many. Um, this has become it's almost become a grassroots effort. And I see people now having conversations, as I've said before, around the dinner table, around the water cooler at work. It's become something bigger than I ever expected. Um, and I'm very happy to see that. And I'm glad that no one controls the narrative. Well, except for a couple of those hucksters that are trying to. But if you notice, I don't tell people what to think. I'll never do that because that's sacred. And anybody who tells you what to think or that they have all the answers, they're BSing you, man. They're lying to you. And unfortunately, there's people out there that, hook, line, and sinker, as P.T. Barnum said, right? There's a sucker born every minute. Uh, they fall into that. I think this is a conversation we all need to have collectively. And no, I don't think it needs to be only a national security discussion. As I mentioned before, I don't want that three-star general that I mentioned earlier telling me what to think about this topic, other than from a national security perspective. This topic involves everybody, as I've always said, differently and yet equally, depending how you were raised and your religious background and your cultural background. This topic involves us as human beings from a philosophical perspective, a psychological perspective, a sociological perspective, and even a theological perspective. And from those perspectives, I don't want the Pentagon involved in those conversations. I don't want my government dictating to the American people what we should think about something. Let us figure that out, right? Let's not make the same mistake as we did with the Dead Sea Scrolls and these other things. Let the conversation happen organically. And that's what I'm trying to do, without, hijacking the narrative. People will notice that a lot of times when I do a lot of these podcasts, I'll step back for a little bit. I'll step back for half a year, even a year. And the reason is because I don't want people to confuse the messenger with the message, right? I am not this spectacular, awesome dude and hero. I'm just a father and a patriot, just trying to do his best to speak the truth. Again, no different than anybody else. You're doing it right now by having this podcast. Your listeners are doing it right now by listening to this conversation and being part of this conversation. This is a groundswell that's happening because of you, not really me. I may help a little bit here and there, in the periphery, but we are here today, make no mistake, because of people like you and your audience. That's why Congress is paying attention. This is why the new administration and our government is paying attention to this topic because of you. This is why the international community and religions are paying attention.
I'm certainly glad that there's such a growing interest about this topic, and I think that we're all very fortunate to have people like you who are, bringing it to the forefront and allowing these conversations to happen. Um, I know you can't provide any details, but are you aware of any new evidence or whistleblowers who may be coming forward in the next few months?
You bet.
That's great to know. So we have some things to look forward to then.
Absolutely.